Okay, hello. This week I want to talk about Kosovo again. I want to return to that and talk about the conflict that ignited there at the end of the 1990s, 1998 and 1999. Now, before I do, I wanted also to recommend a very good documentary called The Fall of Milosevic. You'll remember Milosevic. We'll talk a little bit about him in today's session, but of course, Milosevic was the Serbian communist leader who rose to political prominence in the mid 1980s, had used Kosovo as a vehicle for his own political ambitions, and is the man that many people feel is most directly responsible, not only for the breakup of Yugoslavia, but for all of the very negative conflicts and the problems that accompanied that breakup. So it's a three-part documentary, and I put up links to it on Moodle. And this is a very useful background as well. It's by the same people who made The Death of Yugoslavia, the documentary which I've been recommending throughout this module. This is a very good documentary which talks a little bit about some of the things that I'm going to raise in today's session, in this session. But it takes the story a little bit further than we're going. It goes up to October 2000, which we won't talk about in this session. We might talk about that a little bit later on. But October 2000 was the end of Milosevic's reign. There was a kind of a revolution, a popular revolt against Milosevic, which resulted in his being removed from power in October 2000. So it talks a little bit about the conflict that we're talking about today in Kosovo. It goes on to talk about the downfall of Milosevic. As I say, a very good documentary. Just like The Death of Yugoslavia, a lot of very important, prominent actors are interviewed and are featured in this documentary, and it gives a little bit of a little bit more detail and more information to the things that we're talking about today. Okay, so let's have a look then. We left the story in our last session. We talked about the end of the conflicts in Croatia and Bosnia, and I told you that essentially the war in Bosnia had ended. When NATO and the Western powers had become, kind of lost their patience with the Bosnian Serbs, believing that they were the aggressors in this conflict, and they had decided to take action against the Bosnian Serbs. There had been a series of very provocative military acts by the Bosnian Serb forces. We'd spoken about Srebrenica in our last session. There was also two marketplace bombings. Serbian artillery bombed civilians in the marketplaces in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, which Bosnian Serb forces had been besieging during the war. So at the end, in the summer of 1995, NATO decided that this was time to sort of to try and end this conflict. Pushed Serbian forces back into the east of the country, and called a ceasefire, which would then be settled at Dayton, Ohio, with this peace conference. And around about the same time, I'd shown that the conflict in Croatia, which had been largely frozen since the autumn of 1991 and the spring of 1992, also erupted again in the summer of 1995. Croatian forces, Tudjman's forces, launched two military operations to remove the political separatist forces and military forces of the Bosnian Serbs, Operation Storm and Operation Flash. And these ultimately resulted in large-scale ethnic cleansing of the Serbian minorities who were living in these territories. Almost all of them were removed. About 600,000 people sent back to Serbia. So these acts, these last sort of military acts, allowed the participants, the actors in these conflicts, to meet in Dayton to sign a series of peace accords. And they were relatively complex, but essentially they called, for the independence, the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the independence and the sovereignty of the successor states. And in the case of Bosnia, it called for a very complicated and convoluted constitutional setup which would mean that Bosnia was an independent sovereign state, but it was divided internally into two entities. A Western entity, the Bosnian Croat Federation, and an Eastern entity, the Serbian Republic, or the Republika Srpska. And that is pretty much the situation as it stands to this day. Now, there was perhaps quite some surprise at the end of all of these conflicts, at the apparent end in 1995, that Kosovo had not played a more prominent role. Now, if you think back to earlier on in these sessions, earlier on in our lectures, we'd looked at how the Kosovar question and the Kosovar problem had raised itself quite early on in the conflicts. We'd seen, in fact, that very soon after the death of Tito in 1981, there had been riots. Pristina University, Albanian university students at the University of Pristina had called for greater autonomy. They'd wanted Kosovo to become not just an autonomous region of Yugoslavia, but in fact a republic like Serbia, like Croatia, like Bosnia, and like the other republics. It was the poorest of the parts of Yugoslavia, and we'd also mentioned, hadn't we, that it had this very delicate ethnic balance between the Serbs and the Kosovars and the Kosovo Albanians. So the Kosovo Albanians were the vast majority, and they were getting larger, and the Serbian minority was getting smaller. And in addition to this, the Serbs were increasingly feeling, rightly or wrongly, that they were the persecuted group in Kosovo. So many people thought that this would be most likely be the big flashpoint, the big problem. Now, if we turn to slide number 3, there's a very quick recap of some of the history of Kosovo, which we in fact covered in one of our early sessions, but we can very quickly go over it once again here. So as I say, Kosovo was central to both Albanian and Serbian national identities. The Serbian minority living in Kosovo and the Albanian majority both felt very, very strong ties and very strong affiliations with this territory. If you remember, I told you that in the case of the Serbs, they believed there was this kind of notion that Kosovo was, this was the site of their battle, their historic defeat in 1389. This was sacred ground. Many of the Serbian Orthodox Christian monasteries were there. It was very central to sort of the national awakening of the 19th century, and it was almost like sacred space, like holy space. For the Serbs, and to a certain extent, it was also for the Albanians. This had been Ottoman territory for centuries. It had been heavily sort of Ottomanized, Islamicized. There was this Albanian majority there, and many Albanians also felt that this was very very sacred space for them. Now, throughout the 20th century, Kosovo had been part of Yugoslavia, and it had been part of Serbia as well. Apart from these kind of moments of having autonomous control. Now, its history within Yugoslavia had been a very unhappy one. When it was integrated after the First World War, the initial plan by the Serbian government in Belgrade was simply to assimilate these territories, to not recognize its separate status, to turn this into a kind of Serbian territory, to colonize this territory, to remove all traces of the Ottoman heritage, and to try to transform this territory into something that would resemble a Serbian national space. So colonizing, building Serbian churches, remaking the territory of this land. Now you can imagine that this was resisted quite heavily by many of the Albanian population. So the history of the interwar period is a very unhappy one. A history of the Belgrade government forcibly attempting to assimilate this territory, and the Albanian population there attempting to push back. Now, if you remember, we talked about what happened after the Second World War, initially at least until the 1960s. from the end of the Second World War, when the socialists came to power, when Tito's regime came to power, Kosovo fell under the sort of the purview of the very powerful Yugoslav, the boss of Yugoslav state security, a Serbian called Alexander Rankovic. And Rankovic looked at Kosovo as potentially a hotspot of anti-Yugoslav sentiment. He was deeply distrustful of the Kosovo Albanians. He believed that they had collaborated with the Axis during the Second World War. He initially, at least, believed that this was potentially a group of people who would be separatist, of separatist inclination, that they would want to join a greater Albanian state. Albania, of course, just south of the border. You can see it on this map in slide number 3. And so for Rankovic, was a very powerful and a very stern, a very strict security boss throughout Yugoslavia, but he especially identified Kosovo as potentially a troublesome area, potentially a troublesome spot. Now, Rankovic fell out of favor in 1996. He was removed from his offices after falling out with Tito, and then essentially there are various reasons for this, but it looks as if Tito was getting concerned that Rankovic was becoming a potential rival to his power, and so had him removed in 1966. Sorry. Now, that was the beginning of a transformed status within Kosovo. From 1966 onwards, whereas before that, the Kosovo Albanians had been very badly treated and had been very persecuted in Kosovo. After the fall of Rankovic, things started to change, and once again, the party organs, the universities, the schools, the army bureaus, this kind of thing, were better. Albanians were better represented in these public spaces, in these public institutions, and this culminated in 1974. With Kosovo receiving the status of an autonomous province, an autonomous region within Yugoslavia, so an ever elevated level of autonomy. Now, of course, the flip side of this is that now the Serbs, the Kosovo Serbs, who in a sense had fared quite well under Rankovic, who, as I say, was a Serb and trusted the Serbs much more than he trusted the Kosovo Albanians. Now, from 1974 onwards, the Serbs in Kosovo were increasingly feeling as if they were the group that was marginalized, they were the group that was persecuted, and it was the Albanians who were getting all of the best all of the best deal and the best kind of the best treatment within the province. Now, in a sense, that's the backstory. This switch in the 1960s and the 1970s is the backstory behind the rise of Milosevic, behind the leaked memorandum in the mid-1980s that we talked about a few weeks ago. If you remember the memorandum complaining about the poor treatment of Serbs throughout the country, but particularly in Kosovo. And it was felt that this kind of, that this new situation, this supposedly unfair treatment that the Serbs were receiving in Kosovo was kind of the wind behind Milosevic's sails. It was this resentment, this feeling of persecution amongst the Kosovo Serbs, which allowed Milosevic to become, to use this as an issue to sort of push his own agenda. His own political fortunes forward. Now, obviously, if we slip to slide number 4, of course, we've covered this territory, we've covered this ground already in the first episode of The Death of Yugoslavia, but in the early chapters also of the book, The Death of Yugoslavia, and in some of our sessions earlier on. We'd seen that Milosevic used the issue of Kosovo to sort of propel his own political fortunes throughout the country, and by the end of the this is kind of from the mid-1980s until the end of the 1980s, Milosevic had emerged as something like a new Tito, a man who would kind of look out for the fortunes of the Serbs, throughout the country, but particularly in Kosovo. One of the things that one of the things that Milosevic did was once again restrict the autonomy of Kosovo. This is something that he did in 1989. So once again, the situation in Kosovo reversed. No longer were the Kosovo Albanians in a good position. They were once again in a poor position. Their autonomy was restricted. Under Milosevic's very hard rule, civil rights, human rights were violated, and once again the situation for the Albanians was a very negative one, a very grievous one. Now, initially, with all of this in mind, and in the context of the country beginning to separate as well, it was that the Albanians living in Kosovo hoped that all they needed to do was kind of keep quiet. The worst things got, the worst Milosevic organized or disorganized the country. The worst things would get, the country would fall apart, and then the question of independence for Kosovo would quite naturally emerge. The Kosovo Albanians in the end of the 1980s, the beginning of the 1990s, looking at what had happened in Slovenia, looking at what happened in Croatia, and now looking at this terrible conflict in Bosnia, were deeply concerned and deeply worried that if they pursued a military response, if they also took up arms, then they would find themselves in a very difficult position. There would be bloodshed, and most likely they would come the worst off. It was a much smaller province. Milosevic had the JNA, he had these very powerful paramilitary forces who were backing him. And the Kosovo Albanians were deeply concerned that if they pursued some kind of military policy, some kind of military solution, they would alienate the international community, and they would also, really kind of, that they would sort of, that they would end up in deep water. They would end up getting crushed by Milosevic and by his forces. If we turn to slide 6, slide 5. The man most associated, the Kosovo Albanian leader most associated with this policy of peaceful resistance was a man called Ibrahim Rugova, and I put a photo of him up here. Now, Rugova was a writer, and you can probably tell by looking at this image. He looks kind of bohemian, with his long hair and his scarf. He looks like maybe like a Parisian intellectual, glasses, this kind of thing. It doesn't look like a paramilitary leader. He doesn't look like a warlord, although very often, it must be said, the most ferocious warlords don't look particularly. Of course, they don't look particularly tough. That's part of their secret. Now, Rugova was looking at the collapse that was taking place, and he believed, as I said earlier, that the worse things got, the more Milosevic screwed up the country, the more likely Kosovars were to get their independence. He pursued this kind of Leninist policy of saying, okay, well, look, the world is now going to see what a disaster Milosevic is. He's going to see how he's breaking up the country. He's going to see how he's causing these conflicts in Bosnia and Croatia. It'll only be a matter of time before the international community look what's happening here, and they make the same kind of decisions for Kosovo as they have already made for Slovenia and for Croatia, which is to say, they were granted independence. So Rugova believed that the fight did not need to be taken to Milosevic. It was not necessary to wage some kind of military conflict. All that was needed to do was sit and wait and prepare the Kosovo Albanians for this moment of independence. Now, Rugova's preparation was to create essentially a parallel world, and this is essentially what happened in Kosovo in the 1990s. De facto, Kosovo was still part of Serbia, was still part of Yugoslavia, if you like, and it was still controlled by Belgrade, still controlled by Milosevic. But in reality, Albanians and Serbs were living separate lives. Rugova had established a kind of underground state, something not entirely dissimilar to what the Poles had done during the Second World War, with the Home Army, and then, under occupation, they'd created not just an army, but also tax collecting, schools, universities, doctors, tax lawyers, all of this sort of thing. Rugova and the Kosovo Albanians had done something very similar. They had established for themselves an entire society that existed alongside the Kosovo Serbs, but entirely separate from it. So separate universities, separate schools, separate hospitals, separate churches, of course, separate sports teams, separate everything. A lot of the money, a lot of the revenue that was needed, of course, to back this up, was coming from sort of this kind of tax collection, semi-legal, what we might call a blackmail operation. The Rugova was sort of asking Kosovo Albanians to pay a certain amount of taxes that would go to sort of supporting and propping up this alternate regime. They were also getting money from the emigre communities in places like West Germany, and Great Britain and the Netherlands, and these places where Albanians were living, Kosovo Albanians were living abroad. So there are two things happening. On the one hand, Rugova is pursuing a peaceful policy, but on the other hand, he's preparing what he believes is the groundwork for a future independent Kosovo state. So he's expecting independence to come eventually, and he's also not willing to make any kind of military confrontation at this stage with Milosevic, and at this stage with the JNA and with Milosevic's forces. Now, sometimes Rugova's policies could seem to us rather perverse. In 1990, somebody ran in opposition, a guy called Milan Panic, ran in opposition to Milosevic, and Panic was a much more moderate figure than Milosevic, wanted to sort of steer the country away from this nationalist line, wanted to bring it back in line with the international community, wanted to reach an agreement with the remnants of Yugoslavia, and to try to change the direction of the Serbian state. Now, Panic came down to Kosovo, met with political representatives, met with Rugova, and asked them to give him their support against Milosevic in the upcoming elections. And Rugova refused this, not because he disliked Panic, not because he preferred him to Milosevic, but rather because he believed that if somebody like Panic came into power, the situation would indeed change, but it would not be as bad. Milosevic would not so quickly race to the bottom, and the country would not essentially collapse as quickly as he believed and he hoped it would. With Milosevic in charge. Now, if there had been an agreement at this time between the Albanians and between Panic, there's every chance that Milosevic would have been beaten, and who knows, that the sort of trajectory of Serbia and the trajectory of the country could have been a very different one. But as it happened, Panic and Rugova did not come to an agreement, and Milosevic remained in power. Now, there are a couple of switch points which in a sense discredited or transformed Kosovo Albanian policy. And the first one came at Dayton in 1995. There was a terrible disappointment amongst Rugova and amongst the people in Kosovo, the Albanians in Kosovo, who had very patiently waited and very patiently supported his policy of non-confrontation, his policy of non-military engagement, believing that the day of the Kosovo Albanians would indeed come. At Dayton, Kosovo was not mentioned whatsoever. No talk about independence, no talk about its rights to succeed, no talk about what would happen in Kosovo. Now, there were a couple of reasons for this. On the one hand, the brokers of the peace deal, so the British Prime Minister John Major, the American President Bill Clinton, the French Prime Minister the French President Jacques Chirac, had already believed that the situation was delicate enough that it was going to be difficult enough to get peace in Bosnia, to get peace in Croatia, that if they were to mention Kosovo, this would simply muddy the waters even further. Remember, this is very soon after the guns had fallen silent at the end of 1995, and there was every expectation that Dayton could well fail, and that the fighting could once again start. So Kosovo was not mentioned for one reason, because the situation was already complicated enough. The international community felt like they had enough on their hands, and they didn't want to sort of complicate the situation even further. But on the second hand, if you remember what I'd mentioned, what I told you in our last session, the Bosnian Serbs were represented, the Serbian interests were represented by Milosevic, the Serbian leader at Dayton. And the international community, the brokers of the peace accord, so Clinton, the American team, the British team, the French team, were sort of painfully aware that if Milosevic was not kept on side, and if the Serbs were not kept on side, then there could be no peace. So Milosevic, in a sense, had transformed. He was no longer seen as a problematic figure. He was no longer seen as a difficult figure. It was believed by the international community, as Richard Holbrooke, the special envoy for the United States, said, that this was a man that we could do business with, a man who we could work with. So Milosevic's signature, Milosevic's cooperation at Dayton were absolutely essential in the eyes of the international community. His participation was absolutely essential to ensuring the success of the Dayton Peace Accords. But they knew, or they suspected, that if issues like Kosovo were mentioned, if they were brought up, that this would put a huge amount of pressure. That this would put pressure on Milosevic at home, that he would not be happy with this issue of Kosovo being raised, and this would cause all kinds of problems to the peace accords. So you can imagine then that this was extremely disappointing for many Kosovo Albanians. They kind of looked at what they've been doing over the last 5 years. They'd looked at this policy of kind of passive resistance, non-military resistance, and now they'd seen what had happened at Dayton, i.e. Their claims and their calls completely ignored. And they believed, in fact, that this was a sign that their policies had failed. So this was one point. Now, the other switch point were events in Albania in 1997. Now, I won't go too much into detail about this, but in Albania, as in other parts of the Balkans in the second half of the 1990s, the country fell into a sort of essentially a state of anarchy. The country's economy collapsed. There were all of these pyramid schemes where a very small handful of people were making huge amounts of money at the expense of the rest of the country. And in 1997, these pyramid schemes almost unanimously collapsed, and with it, the Albanian economy also collapsed. Now, briefly, for several months, there was a period of what amounted to anarchy within the country. The government in Tirana lost control, paramilitaries and warlords took over, and it looked like the country might descend into a state of civil war. Now, eventually it didn't, and eventually the government was able to regain control and get Albania back on track. But before this happened, a lot of weaponry, a lot of guns were sort of available, and ammunition and these sorts of things were available in Albania. And a lot of this material, a lot of this military hardware found its way across the border, up north, and into Kosovo. So there are these kind of two switch points, if you like. On the one hand, Dayton is rightly perceived, as a disappointment for many Albanians, including Rugova, who had hoped that the Kosovo suit for independence would be met by the international community at Dayton. This is one thing, and then the other thing, this kind of anarchy in Albania, which creates which creates the sort of an availability of weapons which could now be used if a different policy within Kosovo is pursued. Okay, now if we move to slide number 7, we can see the forces that replaced Rugova in the second half of the 1990s. A new group came through in Kosovo, who sort of believed the Rugova's policies of non-confrontation had failed. That the lesson of Dayton was that if you don't make a noise, if you don't sort of attack the enemy, if you don't raise this issue on the battlefield, then you have no hope of achieving your goals, of achieving independence. And this new group was called the Kosovo Liberation Army. In English, the KLA would be the initials of this movement, but very often they're known by their Albanian initials, the UÇK. Now, the KLA were a group largely of sort of emigre Kosovo Albanians, many of them based in places like West Germany, in Scandinavia, in France, and the Netherlands, who had been raising money and who had been interested and been hopeful that Kosovo would achieve independence, and had been very disappointed at what had happened in 1995, had become disillusioned with the way Ibrahim Rugova was approaching the matter of gaining independence for Kosovo, and had decided that a much more confrontational military response was required in order to kind of transform this landscape. So the KLA became the most important political and military factor within Kosovo in the second half of the 1990s. And the KLA, their intention was to gain independence from Serbia for Kosovo through military confrontation, through raids on army barracks, through raids on police stations, by attacking Milosevic's forces, by attacking his groups, and in this way kind of, raising this issue as an international concern, and confronting Milosevic and confronting Serbia. Now you can imagine that the Milosevic was willing to meet and to match the sort of the KLA, hand for hand. That already this civil rights and human rights were in very sort of poor shape in Kosovo as a result of these restrictions that Milosevic had put in place, as a result of this new kind of atmosphere, this tense kind of atmosphere within Kosovo. The arrival of the KLA and the beginning of what Milosevic claimed was a terror campaign against Serbia upped the ante considerably, and transformed this into essentially an outright military conflict. This is from sort of the end of from sort of 97, 98 onwards. So in the wake of Dayton, in the wake of the end of the conflicts in Bosnia and Croatia, and in the beginning of this sort of rise of the KLA. Now we turn to slide number 8. We can see what usually people claim is the beginning of the conflict between Serbian forces in Kosovo, the beginning of outright conflict. In February and March 1988, Yugoslav police attempted to arrest a paramilitary leader of a leading member of the KLA, a man called Adam Yashari. And Yashari lived in a very large compound with many members of his extended family, and he was kind of holed up in this compound, and the Yugoslav police came in to arrest him. He and his family, of course, resisted this arrest, and the Yugoslav police, came in extremely heavy-handedly. And escalated this kind of conflict. Now, as a result of this raid, Adem Yashari was killed, and along with him, about 58 members of his extended family, many of them children, or at least some of them children, many of them women, and in many cases unarmed people. So this was, in a sense, there was a military goal here. The Yugoslav forces, Milosevic's forces, wanted to arrest Adam Yashari. He was a leading member of the KLA, so in their eyes he was a legitimate target. But at the same time, they'd really come into this compound very heavy-handedly. They had not exercised a huge amount of caution, and many people imagined that this heavy-handed approach was a deliberate attempt to kind of intimidate and to sort of cow the KLA and their leaders into submission. Now you can imagine that exactly the opposite thing happened. The killing of 58 members of the Yashari clan escalated the conflict enormously, mobilized Kosovar support, Albanian support behind the KLA, created very many new members, and escalated this conflict considerably. And the KLA, in a sense, were quite similar to the IRA in various respects, and in fact they did have some contact, these two groups. But the most notable similarity, one of the more notable similarities, was the way these kind of funerals of KLA commanders or KLA combatants became great moments of mobilization and great moments of sort of recruiting for the KLA. So someone like Adam Yashari or one of these KLA soldiers or commanders was killed. There would be a funeral, and these funerals become sites of mass protest. This is something quite similar has happened, of course, in Libya and Syria during the years of the conflict and during the years of the Arab Spring. So the conflict escalates from spring 1998, and it becomes essentially a full-scale conflict in the course of 1998, a war between the KLA on the one hand and Milosevic's forces backed by paramilitaries on the other. Now it's quite an ugly situation, and one must remember that a lot of the refugees, the Serbian refugees who have come from places like Kosovo and Bosnia, have been relocated by Milosevic into Kosovo. So in a sense, they've gone from the frying pan into the fire. They've been expelled from their homes, and they're deeply sort of bitter. They're deeply angry about this, and they've been moved into Kosovo, which of course is another hotspot. Okay, now the international community could become involved in January 1999. An American envoy, a man called William Walker, is inspecting there's been a brief ceasefire, or supposed ceasefire, which has been breached. And an American envoy is is kind of surveying and looking at various sites within Kosovo, and he's taken to Račak, and he sees evidence of a massacre that has taken place there against Kosovo Albanians. So Kosovar Serbs and Serbian forces have massacred, I think, about 38 seemingly unarmed Kosovar Albanian men, who the Serb forces claim are KLA affiliates, KLA members, combatants in a sense. So the international community is horrified, and the sort of the mood now, there is a feeling at the beginning of 1999, I think the right feeling amongst many countries and many members of the international community in the West, that they had failed to act in a timely fashion to prevent killings in Croatia and particularly in Bosnia. In the mind of many Western observers and many Western commentators and many Western leaders, there's a feeling that the genocide in Srebrenica was a failure. It was created. That they didn't act quick enough, they didn't act decisively enough, and if they had done, they would have been able to prevent what had happened there. They would have been able to prevent this genocide. And so, looking at now the escalation of the conflict in Kosovo, there was a sense that, okay, we failed to act in a timely fashion. Then we must now act decisively. In Kosovo, we cannot allow what happened in Bosnia to happen again in Kosovo. We must do something. We must protect the humanitarian interests of this region. We must act decisively to prevent further killing and further acts of genocide. Kosovo must not become another Bosnia. Now, the Racak massacre and its kind of witnessing the aftermath, witnessing the aftermath by William Walker was a sense, it gave the sense, oh my God, okay, that the same thing that had happened in Bosnia could now conceivably happen in Kosovo as well. So, the sides were brought together in a beautiful French chateau. This is slide number 10, a place called Rambouillet, in March 1991. And the US Secretary of State, a woman of Czech origin, in fact, a woman named Madeleine Albright, was one of the key negotiators for the western side. Now, the hope here was that Milosevic and the KLA and the Serbian forces and the various groups would be able to thrash out some kind of agreement, that the killing could be stopped, that both sides could be, an agreement could be reached. The Milosevic's forces would pull out, and there would be some understanding about the future of Kosovo. I won't go into too much detail on this. It's actually in the second episode of the fall of Milosevic, so it's up on Moodle. A very good description of what happened, interviews with Madeleine Albright, interviews with Hashim Thaçi, the leader of the KLA, who was still a political personality 20 years on in Kosovo, much to the complaint of many people there. It was hoped that an agreement could be reached by all sides, but it was really not clear exactly what an agreement would look like. Hashim Thaçi and the KLA, of course, would want to go on fighting until they could get independence for Kosovo. This was their aim, and anything short of this would be a failure, and really would not be accepted by the KLA commanders back in Kosovo. So that was what it looked like from their perspective. At the other end of the spectrum, from Milosevic's perspective, the notion that Kosovo would become independent was also unacceptable to most Serbs. And in fact, in April 1998, Milosevic had held a referendum within Serbia about the future status of Kosovo, and he had asked the Serbian people what they thought the future of this territory should be. Should it remain part of Serbia? Should it become an independent state? What should the agreement be? And a majority of the respondents to this referendum, unfortunately, I don't have the figures to hand, but you can find them quite easily, even online. The majority of people who responded decided that they did not want, the majority of Serbs who responded decided that they did not want Kosovo to become an independent territory. So Milosevic's negotiating position was the polar opposite of Hashim Thaçi's, and it seemed that no agreement would be forthcoming. And in fact, what happened, and again, you can see this in the documentary, is that Hashim Thaçi called Milosevic's bluff. An agreement about sort of increased autonomy was offered, that Kosovo for the time being would remain part of Serbia, would remain part of what was left of Yugoslavia, but it would have an increased level of autonomy. Now, this was not what the KLA wanted, but they signed this agreement knowing that the terms would be unacceptable to Milosevic. So in a sense, as I said, they called his bluff. Milosevic refused to sign this agreement, left the Rambouillet agreement, and essentially now the international community determined that on the one hand, the KLA were looking for peace. The KLA had agreed to the terms of what was now known as the Rambouillet Agreement, but Milosevic was spoiling. Milosevic was refusing to remove his troops. Milosevic was refusing to withdraw from Kosovo, and action needed to be taken against him. Now, it was not likely that this was really the sort of the solution that the people wanted, not the solution the West wanted, obviously not the solution that Milosevic wanted, and not exactly the solution that the KLA wanted. But in fact, this is how it played out. NATO and the Western forces, in a sense, did not have any choice other than to now launch a military campaign against Milosevic, because he had sort of reneged, he had not signed the deal. So at the beginning of March, or in March 1999, from March until June, NATO launched an air campaign, a bombing campaign against targets in Kosovo, Serbian targets in Kosovo, but also in Serbia proper. It lasted 78 days. And this was an attempt to get Milosevic to withdraw his troops from Kosovo and to sort of renounce his claim on Kosovo. Now, it was not expected that this would last so long, and Milosevic was hoping that he could hold out as long as possible, because he believed that the air campaign would fail. There would have to be some kind of limited ground campaign, and that this would be that NATO would take casualties, and this would be politically unacceptable. For the American government, for the British government, for the French government, for the NATO forces. This was in 1999, so it wasn't that long after these terrible scenes in Somalia, the so-called Black Hawk Down incident, where Bill Clinton had sent American troops in. They had been killed by paramilitaries in Somalia. Footage of them being killed, American soldiers being killed, had made the national news, and there'd been a huge backlash against the wisdom, against continuing this military campaign, and Bill Clinton had been forced to withdraw his troops. And Milosevic kind of had these things in his mind, and he believed that if he could string out the air campaign long enough, NATO would have to switch to a ground campaign, and this would be too politically costly to be continued for any great length of time. In fact, in the event, NATO never moved into this period of into this phase of the ground campaign. They just kept picking out new targets. So they started with military targets. They moved on to sort of economic targets. They moved on to political targets. They extended this campaign, and eventually ended in June 1999. All sides would claim victory. Milosevic did indeed have to withdraw from Kosovo, and Kosovo became a UN protectorate, at least for the time being. De facto independent, but in this kind of limbo zone of still officially being part of Yugoslavia, still officially being part of Serbia, but nevertheless being out of control, out of the control of Serbian forces, out of the control of Milosevic. But at the same time, Milosevic was still in power. The NATO hopes to sort of bomb him out of control, bomb him out of his position, had not come through, and NATO was still very much in charge. And for many Serbs, including many of my friends, it must be said, who lived through this and who went through this, in fact, Milosevic's support had sort of slightly risen. Because there was a feeling that this NATO bombing was unfair, that the Serbs were being unfairly sort of victimized and persecuted by the West, and then in fact quite the opposite, that Milosevic was in a sense protecting their interests from the West. So in fact, it had, in many ways, this bombing campaign had a counterproductive outcome. The outcomes of this bombing campaign were counterproductive. Now, we'll talk a little bit later when we talk about the legacies in a later session. When we talk about the contemporary states, we can talk a little bit about what happened in Kosovo in the 20 years after. after the Rambouillet Agreement, after the bombing of Serbia, after the bombing of Yugoslavia. Ultimately, the country did become independent. Although this independence has not been universally recognized, Serbia, of course, still does not recognize the independence of Kosovo, Russia, and various states elsewhere. A few in Europe, but mainly, in sort of Latin America and China and these sorts of places have not yet, at least, recognized the independence of Kosovo. The architects, one of the architects of this campaign against Kosovo was the British Prime Minister, and in 1999, the British Prime Minister was Tony Blair. And Tony Blair, in a sense, took what he believed was the lesson of Kosovo and went on to apply it elsewhere. Kosovo, for him, was a successful operation, and it was also an operation which proved, in his mind, that the war could be waged, if you like, for humanitarian reasons. The tyrants, the bullies like Milosevic needed to be confronted. You needed to show sort of superior force against them, and this was a way of putting them back in their place. And of course, it was only a few years later, in 2003, that Tony Blair attempted to apply those lessons in Iraq, and even by his own admission, the consequences of that decision was a disastrous one. So the Kosovo issue, which rose its head in the 1990s, ended in, if you like, in a kind of indecisive way. At the end of 1999, so in June 1999, Milosevic was still in power, although admittedly he would not be in power much longer after that. Kosovo was still part of Yugoslavia. A United Nations resolution, 1244, acknowledged that it was an integral part of Yugoslavia, integral part of Serbia. But nevertheless, in practical terms, it was no longer part of Serbia. Milosevic was no longer able to extend his authority into this territory. And to all intents and purposes, the KLA were now the new political masters of Kosovo. Thank you.